Well, hello everyone. And if you are new here, welcome to Recovery Jam. And if you're not new, thanks for joining us in the morning. The morning here, and welcome to our friends over in Europe who are joining us in their afternoon. Um, so today I'm going to do a little talk on Bill's story. I love this story because when I looked through it, I saw 10 things that Bill tried that didn't work. And ultimately, the only one that did, the thing that works for all of us addicts. So if you have your big book, Bill's story opens on page 1, and he starts off talking about going to war. He says, I was part of life at last, and in the midst of the excitement, I discovered liquor. And later on, he says, I forgot the strong warnings and the prejudices of my people concerning drink. I was lonely and again turned to alcohol. So here's a couple of things that didn't help him. Number one, changing circumstances. Things were really bad, and that's when he turned to alcohol, when he was lonely. And then he says, I was part of life at last. It was hilarious, exciting, and I discovered alcohol. So if we think changing our circumstances is going to help us, it probably won't. He drank when he was lonely, then he drank when he was happy. And that was me. I binged and I thought, oh, I binged because I'm miserable. And then I remember something really good happening in my life and I was happy and I binged. And so I just said, oh, I'm binging to sabotage my happiness. But both of those were wrong. I didn't binge because I was miserable. I didn't binge because I was happy and trying to sabotage it. I binged because I wasn't in a state of protection by God. And we'll get to that later on. Um, so, anyway, changing circumstances never does it. Imagine someone with cancer saying, I think I'll move from New York to London, and that will make my cancer cells stop multiplying. But of course, it won't. We take our illness with us. So, the second thing he says, number two, he says, I forgot the strong warnings I had heard, right? It's like, what if someone says to me, look both ways before you cross the street? Because if you don't, a truck will hit you and you'll end up in the hospital. I am going to remember that, right? I'm going to look both ways before I cross the street. Or if I had pneumonia and the doctor said, to get over pneumonia, make sure you take your antibiotic twice a day for 10 days. I'm going to remember to do that. But something as important as alcohol and the dangers of it, Bill forgot the warnings. And we've talked about this before, that in people like us, the connection between our memory and our conscious mind is broken. We can't recall the suffering and the humiliation of even a binge that was just 24 hours ago. And we will go into that in massive detail next week. So anyway, Bill heard alcohol is bad for you. But when he wanted to take a drink, that strong warning, alcohol is bad for you, couldn't make it across to his conscious mind where he made his decisions to stop him. The strong warnings of other people never did anything for us, right? None of us are here because someone warned us. So there's Bill. He goes to war. He comes back from war and he goes to law school. And what happens to him? He says at one of his final exams, I was too drunk to think or write. So now I went to law school, and in law school, most classes, 100% of your grade is based on that one exam. So this is pretty important. So I would say number three is necessity. Bill needed to be sober when he took his final exam, but he couldn't. Necessity doesn't help. So if I say, well, I need to lose weight so I can fit into that nice dress when I go to that wedding next week. And by the way, y'all, my daughter's wedding is in 2 weeks, and I'm not worried about fitting into the dress. Very exciting. Or someone says, well, the doctor told me my blood pressure is dangerously high. I need to lose weight. No one lost weight because of that. Necessity doesn't do it for people like us. So Bill finishes law school and he says, the law is not for me. He was interested in business. So there he went. Life is really good for a while. And then what happens? The stock market crashes, things get bad. But he was still okay for a while. Page 4, we hear him saying, I was determined to win again. And the next morning, I called a friend in Montreal and went to Canada. So again, he's trying a geographic cure. But he's able to stop for short periods of time until page 5, where he says, liquor ceased to be a luxury. It became a necessity. See, at some point, maybe we could have stopped. A lot of us can think back to a time where we could have stopped if we really wanted to. I can't. By age 4, I was already obsessing about the snacks they were going to be serving in nursery school. But here was Bill. Liquor ceased to be a luxury, it became a necessity. And once we cross the line where it's a necessity, we can't save ourselves anymore. We need to be rescued. It's like we're in quicksand or an undertow. We can't rescue ourselves anymore. And Bill says things got worse. He loses his house. And then, but Bill, ever the optimist, says, I got this great opportunity. Things are going to work. And then he went on a prodigious bender. I meant to one time look up that word prodigious. I don't know what it means, but I think it means something like a really bad bender. And then that chance vanished. So here he is. And what does he do? He says, I woke up. This had to be stopped. I saw I could not take so much as one drink. So he knew his alcoholic threshold, which was 0. He could not have one drink. He said, I was through. I had written lots of sweet promises before, but my wife happily observed, this time I meant business. And so I did. So, number 4, the fourth thing he tried was commitment, really meaning business. Well, that doesn't help. I mean, think back to our poor cancer patient whose cancer cells are multiplying and says, I am really committed to making my cancer cells stop multiplying. Our hearts would break because we would know that no matter how sincere that person was, they couldn't do it. They didn't have the power. Commitment alone won't do it because lack of commitment usually isn't our problem. It's lack of power. Now, by the way, if we don't have commitment, it's not going to work. But we could have commitment and still not get anywhere if we don't have the power. So what happens to poor Bill? He means business, but he keeps getting drunk. And he says, I began to wonder if I was crazy, bottom of page 5. For such an appalling lack of perspective seemed near being just that, a lack of perspective. Thinking I can do things that time and time again, I should see that I can't do. So, guys, sometimes I still think I have the knees of a 20-year-old. So I'll go to the gym and I'll do some like really heavy squats and leg presses. And I'll come home and I'll need to ice my knees and not work out for a while because I'm not 25. I am next week 65. And I cannot work out like I'm 25. So sometimes I have a lack of perspective at the gym, but it's not dire, right? I rest my knees for a few days and I'm fine. But a lack of perspective is a hallmark for an addict. And for addicts, it's deadly. So what happens? Page 6. One day, Bill goes into a cafe to use a telephone. Not really smart. It's like someone who's newly abstinent walking into Haagen-Dazs to use the phone. And the phone is all the way in the back of the ice cream parlor. So, no surprise, Bill gets drunk. But being a good addict, what does he tell himself? He says, I'll manage better next time, but I may as well get good and drunk now. So number 5 is what I call the pillow cure. I'll do whatever I want now, eat as much as I want now, drink as much as I want now, because I'll be able to start tomorrow. 8 hours with my head on a pillow, and that will suddenly give me the power that I didn't have yesterday. So it's like I have a magic pillow, right? The magic pillow cure, the I'll start tomorrow syndrome. It doesn't work because nothing happens between last night and this morning. There's no magic pillow. So, what happened to Bill the next day? Of course, that magic pillow didn't work. And he says, the remorse, horror, and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. You know, normally remorse, horror, and hopelessness convince us we shouldn't do things again. I grew up in Miami Beach, Florida. I had the experience of going to the beach and not putting on sunscreen because I wanted just a really cute little tan. And then, to my horror, the next day, instead of a cute little tan, my skin was peeling off, my face was bright red. I looked like a disgusting little lobster. So what did I do? The next time I went to the beach, I put on my sunscreen because I did not want to go through that remorse and horror again. But for an alcoholic or a compulsive eater, remorse doesn't help. And that's number 6. What is remorse? It's feeling strong guilt, but strong guilt doesn't do it. Who of us ever said, oh, I feel so guilty that I ate my roommate's food. I think I'll stop binging, and then was just able to stop the next day? Not me. I would eat my roommate's food, go out to buy a replacement, and eat the replacement before I could get it back. And that remorse didn't do it. And feeling hopeless doesn't do it. The only time that hopelessness is good is if at the time we feel hopeless and we really get that we're hopeless, someone presents us with a real solution. But plain old remorse, horror, and hopelessness, that usually just ends up with us feeling self pity. And as my friend Roxanne said to me once, self pity parties usually end with a cake. So for 2 more years, Bill goes on like this. He steals from his wife. He tries all sorts of things. He goes to a hospital, and he says on page 7, understanding myself now, I fared forth in high hopes. For 3 or 4 months, the goose hung high. Again, I have no idea what that means to say the goose hung high. I assume it means things were just fine. And Bill says, I went to town regularly. I even made a little money. Surely this was the answer, self-knowledge. So 2 more things Bill tried here. Number 7, desire, and number 8, self-knowledge. But desire without spiritual help doesn't work. Desire alone is not a cure for any illness. Anyone with cancer has a desire for her cancer cells to stop multiplying. Desire alone doesn't work. Last month, I had a really bad cold, and we were about to go on a cruise to Alaska. I had a very strong desire to get better fast on my own. I needed to go to the doctor and get some medicine. Desire alone doesn't do it. If we have an illness, we need intervention. And then Bill says, self-knowledge, this was the answer. Well, self-knowledge doesn't work, right? I could know that if I had cancer, I might know exactly how I got it, which people generally don't. But let's say I got it and I know, oh, I got it because I live near a toxic radiation waste site, and that's what gave me the cancer. Okay, so what? Now I know why I have it. It doesn't make it go away. Self-knowledge doesn't help. With food, I could know my binge foods. Well, if that was enough, all we need to do is make a list of those binge foods and stay away from them. That's self-knowledge. All we'd have to do is list them and avoid them. And we wouldn't need 12 steps. But I could make a list of all my binge foods and it wouldn't matter because my problem isn't lack of knowledge, it's lack of power. Self-knowledge alone doesn't do anything. So page 8, we see again, along with the remorse, horror, and hopelessness, we've added loneliness, despair, and self-pity. And how does Bill describe his bottom? He says, quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. And he still didn't stop. And here's number 9, what doesn't work: a first step alone. A first step alone does nothing. I can admit I'm powerless over food and my life is unmanageable. That alone gets me nowhere. Again, imagine going to the doctor and the doctor showing me my x-ray and saying, "You have cancer." And I'm like, "Okay, I admit I have cancer. I'm powerless over it. And cancer surely makes my life unmanageable." And then the doctor saying, "Great, now that you've admitted it, now your cancer cells will stop multiplying." It doesn't work that way because a first step alone doesn't do it. So number 10, here's poor Bill. He goes to the hospital, he goes to rehab. And he says, trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. And then he drank again. So number 10 is fear. So a doctor telling us that if we don't lose weight, we're going to have a heart attack, that doesn't do it. I met a woman at an OA convention once, and this was really sad. She was diabetic, and her doctor told her if she didn't stop eating compulsively and lose some weight, it would affect her eyes and her kidneys. When I met her, she had a seeing eye dog because she was blind, and she was on dialysis waiting for a kidney transplant. Fear doesn't do it. And again, if we think of another illness, back to cancer, someone says to our poor cancer patient, if you don't make your cancer cells stop multiplying, you're going to die. Who would ever say, "Oh, I'm glad you gave me that information. Now I'm really scared. I'm going to snap my fingers and make my cancer cells stop multiplying"? That never happens because fear doesn't do it. And here's why: fear isn't from God, so it can't help. So here's poor Bill. He has tried 10 things. He's tried everything he can think of. And he finally realizes the gravity of his situation. He says, everyone became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up somewhere or would stumble along to a miserable end. But now look at the turn of the story. He says, how dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was the beginning of my last debauch, my last binge. He says, I was soon to be catapulted. And I love that word catapulted. Not I took myself. I was catapulted by an outside entity. I was rescued. I was catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. And I always think of the Wizard of Oz, where it goes from black and white to color. That's my experience. Life starts being in color. So before, he had loneliness, despair, and self-pity. And what does he get now? Happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. Because you guys, just like this illness is progressive, recovery is progressive. Once we get into recovery and start living this way of life, it just keeps getting better and better. So let's find out how it happened, how God launched his search and rescue mission for Bill Wilson. It's November. Bill is drinking in his kitchen, and he's planning on drinking more. The phone rings. It's an old friend who he used to drink with, and his friend Ebby asks if he can come over. Now, Ebby just happened to be in New York at this time. Ebby didn't live in New York. It had been years since his friend Ebby had come to New York, but Ebby just happened to be there, and he just happened to call his friend Bill and say, "Hey, Bill, can I come over?" And Bill's like, "Sure." He doesn't care about Ebby. He just says, "We can drink together." Great. I don't have to drink by myself. This is an oasis in my desert of loneliness. This is great. So remember, he's drinking, planning on drinking more when Ebby comes. And Ebby didn't knock on the door and say, Bill, you're drinking. I'll come back when you have 48 hours. And he didn't wait for Bill to search him out. And by the way, Bill didn't do that when he met Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob was drunk, planning on staying drunk. In a couple months, we'll get to Dr. Bob's story too. So Ebby went in, talks to Bill, and looks at him. And Bill says something was different. He invited him in. He pushed a drink across the table. Here, Ebby, have a drink. And Ebby says, no, thank you. And Bill thinks, what has gotten into him? He wasn't himself. He didn't look like himself. He didn't act like himself. Well, of course not. A butterfly doesn't look like a caterpillar anymore. Ebby had been transformed. Y'all, God isn't in the fix it up a little bit business. He is in the transformation business. Caterpillar to butterfly stuff. So Bill says, okay, what's going on? And Ebby just says, I've got religion. No sugarcoating God. Sometimes, people will say, well, I can't mention God because it might scare people off. Whenever someone says that, I think about, okay, let's say I had pneumonia, which I once did, and I went to the doctor, and the doctor says, you have to take these pills, these antibiotics to get better. And what if I said to the doctor, I don't like taking pills? And the doctor said, okay, just drink orange juice. And that I would die. My lungs would get worse and I would die. A good doctor will never water down the solution just to make it appealing. A good doctor will tell me, I'm sorry, Janet, antibiotics are all I have to offer you. If you don't want that, I got nothing for you. So again, we will talk about this in great detail in a few weeks when we're at We Agnostics. But for now, Ebby just went in and said, I've got religion. No sugarcoating God. But let's be clear what the definition of religion is. It doesn't have to do with churches and clergymen. The definition of religion in the dictionary is the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal God. Even the dictionary, personal God. So when we say God is as I understand him, it's not doorknob as I understand him or light bulb as I understand him, because the definition is the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal God. Now, I might conceive of God differently than you conceive of God, but I think we can agree that a light bulb cannot be a superhuman controlling power that can be personal to us, and I certainly can't worship a doorknob. So Ebby didn't sugarcoat God. He didn't dummy it down so that it would appeal to Bill. He didn't give God some pet name. He just said, I've got religion. And Bill's reaction was, I was aghast. Like, this is crazy. But he said, what the heck? Before he was an alcoholic crackpot. Now he's a religious crackpot, but whatever, let him rant. My gin is going to last longer than his words. But Ebby didn't rant. He just quietly said he'd been so drunk, he was about to be committed for alcoholism. And two men appeared in court and persuaded the judge to suspend his commitment. One of the men who persuaded the judge was a recovered alcoholic, and the judge just happened to be his uncle. See God's fingerprints all over this. And they said, Judge or uncle, give us a little time. We know what can help him. A combination of two things, a simple religious idea. Imagine they use that word religion in court, and a practical program of action. Do God's will as best you can, trust him with the outcome, clear away the wreckage of your past, and help others. And Ebby said, that was 2 months ago, and the result was self-evident. It worked. So 2 months. So today is the end of September. So by Thanksgiving, which is end of November for all you Brits out there, in 2 months, We can all be recovered and carrying the message to other people, even if you are binging today. Grab a sponsor. My number's up by my name. Reach out to me. Either I'll help you or get you in touch with someone who will. 2 months, we can all be the Ebby going to a Bill. So anyway, Ebby had gone through, they didn't have 12 steps then. It was the Oxford group, which had 6 steps, but it was a basic program of surrendering your life to God, clearing away your past, helping others, and living a life of prayer, meditation, and service. And it worked. So fast forward 60 days from Ebby's commitment, and here he is. Ebby's thinking, who can I help? And he's thinking, I'm in New York on business. Let me call my old drinking buddy, Bill. So again, anyone who's binging now, you can be the butterfly in 2 months. So Bill reports that Ebby came to pass this experience on to me if I cared to have it. Bill said, I was shocked, but I was interested. And here's what he says, top of page 10. Certainly I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. So someone comes around and they don't feel hopeless. It's like, yeah, I'd like to lose 10 pounds to look good for my high school reunion. They're probably not going to be interested because this program is a lot of work. But when someone is hopeless, we want them to feel hopeless. We don't want to tell people, oh, don't worry, it'll get better. You know what? It doesn't get better. I was going to meetings when I first came around here, and then I started throwing up while I was in Overeaters Anonymous, maybe twice a week. 6.5 years into OA, I was throwing up 6 times a day and needed major surgery on my esophagus. And people would say, don't worry, it'll get better. Well, just by going to meetings, it didn't get better. It got worse. So here's Bill, and Ebby's talking to him about God, and Bill says, I'd always believed in a power greater than myself. I often pondered these things. So he wasn't an atheist. But he says, when it came to a God personal to me, who was love, superhuman strength, and direction, I became irritated and my mind snapped shut. So he believed in God, but not in a personal God. So he was like a practical atheist, a practical agnostic. And that's how I was. I believed in God, but it made no difference in my life. It's like, I believe there's a king in England, but it makes no difference to my life now. I guess if I moved to Britain, it might matter to me, but it doesn't matter that I believe he exists. And I was like Bill, I believed in God, but I wasn't really interested in anything he had to say to me. In fact, I didn't think he would have anything to say to me. But here's how Ebby described God to Bill: love, superhuman strength, and direction. That's all we need to start. If God is just power and direction, but doesn't care about me, doesn't love me, how am I ever going to feel safe about this God? And if God is love and direction, but isn't strong enough to overcome this illness, well, that doesn't help me. I mean, my mom loved me, but she couldn't help me. But here's a God who loves me, who's strong and will give me direction. And we have access to all three. So then Bill starts talking about the role that religion played in his life. And he says, I adopted those parts which seemed convenient and not too difficult. The rest I disregarded. And isn't that how a lot of us used religion or use these 12 steps? We'll do the parts that are convenient and not too hard. And yeah, I don't really need to do the rest. I don't need to do a fourth step. But Bill had to start doing some soul searching. And he said, okay, I want to believe in God, but there's some things that get in my way. So legitimate things he had to deal with. And again, chapter 4 talks about it in depth, and we will get to that in 3 weeks and go into that in depth. But by the way, if these things are holding you back, don't wait 3 weeks. Get in touch with me or someone who's been through these steps, and we will help you. So remember, Bill had been to war. He'd been in World War I. And he said the war, the burnings. I can only imagine what that means. He said burnings. Like, had he seen towns on fire, people on fire? Says the chicanery, These things made me sick, and judging from what I'd seen in Europe and since, the power of God in human affairs was negligible. If there was a devil, he seemed the boss universal. So Bill had witnessed a lot of calamity, and he's like, well, if there is a God, how could there be all this suffering? And he seemed like he earnestly questioned it. And what did Ebby do? He didn't do what I probably would have done, like get into this big theological conversation about, well, does God cause suffering and allow it, or, all these esoteric points. Ebby didn't do any of that. Thank God he's smarter than me. He basically said, Bill, I don't know. All I know is that God is good. And when I surrendered my life to him, the obsession to drink was taken out of me. And, I guess that's how we can deal with certain things. Like, I don't know why God allows human trafficking. That breaks my heart. If it was up to me, um, God would smite all the traffickers with, a plague of boils. Why did my dad suffer from Parkinson's? And then after my mom nursed him until his death, she got stricken with Alzheimer's. I don't know. And I have to be content this side of heaven to not know. Hopefully at some point I will. But I am okay with believing that God has a plan, and it's okay if I don't understand it. So what does Ebby do? He simply tells Bill, God did for me what I couldn't do for myself. He said, I admitted defeat. And after I admitted defeat, I had been raised from the dead, right? Isn't that us? That was me. In the illness, I was like a living dead person. Ebby said he was suddenly taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he had ever known. He was rescued from the scrap heap to a life of meaning. And he said, had this power originated in him? Obviously, it had not. But there was a power he was able to access. And that's all I need. I don't need to be able to generate electricity myself. I just need to access it. And because Bill knows he's hopeless, he's open-minded. Even though he had all these prejudices, he's open-minded, and God can work with an open mind. And he's like, maybe these religious people are right after all, because Ebby isn't the same Ebby. And he says, and I love this line, my ideas about miracles were drastically revised right then. Never mind the musty past. Here sat a miracle directly across the kitchen table. He shouted great tidings. And great tidings simply means good news. And when we think of miracles, we think of things like Moses parting the Red Sea. And Bill was saying, yeah, that's all in the past. Well and good. Great for Sunday school. But here sat a miracle directly across my kitchen table. A man who was once one way and is now a completely different person. That's the kind of miracle I can be interested in. And that is our only solution, a miracle. The definition of a miracle is a surprising and welcome event that is not explainable by natural or scientific law and is therefore considered to be the work of a divine agency. Bill saw that Ebby was totally different. On page 12, he says, his roots grasped a new soil. It's like he had a root transplant. He had become a different person. But he's still not sure about God. He's a little prickly, and his friend says, why don't you choose your own conception of God? And he says, that did it. All I had to do was be willing. Nothing more was required of me to make a beginning. So willing to believe that there's a God. Okay, what does that mean in practical terms? How can I be willing to believe? And I think it means we can do something like this. We can say to God, God, if you're even there, I don't know if you exist. And if you do exist, I don't know if you care about me. But I hope you do, because I have no hope otherwise. So if you do exist and you do care about me, I need some help. And in the meantime, I'm going to live my life the way I think you would want me to. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to help others. And I'm going to hope and pray that you're real. And if you are, please help me. I believe that God won't be able to resist a prayer like that. Willingness. We can be willing to believe that there's a God who can restore us to sanity. And Bill says, I was convinced that God is concerned with us humans when we want him enough. Well, what is enough? Enough to do this work. Not sit there and say, okay, God, I'm willing to believe you exist. Now come out of your bottle where you exist and be my genie and grant my 3 wishes and then go back in your bottle and leave me alone. No, we have to be willing to do the work that's outlined in these 12 steps. And how does Bill describe it? He says, at long last, I saw, I felt, I believed. Scales of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes. And that's what was blocking him from seeing God, pride and prejudice. What's pride? Thinking too much of myself or thinking of myself too much. And prejudice, thinking too little of others and thinking of others too little. Bill says, when I was younger, I needed and wanted God, and he came. I sensed his presence, but he was blotted out by worldly clamors. So if we want to blot out God, that's all we have to do. Become too concerned with things like our clothes, our jobs, what people think of us, worldly clamors. And then Bill went to the hospital. Why? He said, I showed signs of delirium tremors. That's why he went to the hospital, because it was physically dangerous for him not to withdraw from alcohol without medical help. And he says, right there in the hospital, I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. So it's like saying, God, I believe you're good, or at least you can't mess up my life any worse than I have. Take all of me, not just my food or alcohol, take all of me. I place myself 100% under your care and direction. And then what did Bill do? He cleared away the wreckage of his past. And look how he described it. He says, I ruthlessly faced my sins. So he recovered in the Oxford group. They called them sins. We call them character defects, same thing. He says, I ruthlessly faced them. He was hard on himself. Now, being hard on ourselves gets a bad rap these days. You know, our therapists are always saying something to us like, oh, don't be so hard on yourself. And then we call someone up and do a 10-step and, you know, they say, oh, don't be such a perfectionist. It's a subtle way of getting people to say, don't be so hard on yourself. But Bill says, I ruthlessly faced everything. It's okay to be hard on ourselves when we know that we have a loving God who will forgive us, that we can ask him to remove our defects, we can make amends, and then we're good. There no longer has to be any shame or guilt. But we have to call a spade and ruthlessly face our defects. And then Bill gives us some advice. He says, okay, I've got this new God consciousness within. That's the promise of this program. We will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. Common sense becomes uncommon sense. That's a result of working this program. We intuitively know what to do. And then there's a section about how to handle doubt if I'm unsure about things. Bill says, I was to sit quietly when in doubt, asking, that means praying, only for direction and strength to meet my problems as God would have me. So when we're not sure what to do, we don't pick up the phone and call 17 people. We get quiet and we ask for strength and direction. And then Ebby tells him, when you do these things, you'll enter upon a new relationship with your creator and have the elements of a way of living which answer all your problems. And I think that's really the mission statement of this book, to get a new relationship with our creator where he's God, I'm not, and I'm surrendered to him. And by working these programs, I get the way of life that answers all my problems, my marriage problems, my work problems, my kid problems, my health problems. This program shows me how to deal with them all. So Bill tries to sum up what's necessary to recover. Belief in the power of God, not the existence of God only, but the power of God, plus willingness, honesty, and humility. These are the essential requirements. If we just have willingness, honesty, and humility without the power of God, then we're just doing self-improvement. And I didn't have the power to improve myself. Couldn't stop eating on my own, and I couldn't stop being a mean, nasty, selfish person on my own either. So it tells us, simple but not easy, we have a price to be paid, the destruction of self-centeredness. Chapter 5 says the root of this illness is selfishness and self-centeredness. So the root has to be destroyed. Remember how Bill described Ebby. His roots grasped a new soil. So Bill's in the hospital and the thought came. I love how they say the thought came already. God's directing his thoughts. Bill says there were thousands of hopeless alcoholics who might be glad to have what had been so freely given me. Perhaps I could help some of them. They in turn might work with others. Well, little did he know that shortly after this, about 6 months or so, he just happened to be in Ohio for business, just like Ebby just happened to be in New York. He's in Ohio on business, and the thought came to him in the hospital that maybe he should help someone else and that they in turn could help others. And this is what happened. He helped Dr. Bob and they helped alcoholic number 3 and on and on and on to us here on a Thursday. And I want to highlight the bottom of page 14. I think one of the most critical paragraphs in the book. It says, faith without works was dead, and how appallingly true for the alcoholic, the compulsive eater. For if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through fill in the blank, I would have said prayer and meditation, but that's not what it says. It says we enlarge our spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others. It says then he couldn't survive the certain trials and low spots ahead and would surely drink again. Guaranteed to drink if I don't enlarge my spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others. Now, other people may be able to enlarge their spiritual life through, I don't know, just praying more. And believe me, I am not putting down prayer and meditation. That's essential for spiritual growth. But we are people who, for whatever reason, need to grow spiritually for work and self-sacrifice for others. That's how our spiritual muscles grow. So Bill says, yes, I did this work, but sometimes I was plagued with waves of self-pity and resentment. So it doesn't mean that once we do this work, we're all going to feel fine all the time. We're still going to get resentful. We're still going to get self-pity, but now we have an antidote. Bill says when other measures fail, so I'm assuming he did a 10 step. He reviewed his part. He says work with another alcoholic would save the day. It's a design for living that works in rough going. It's like there's different types of cars, Fords and Chevys, and they're made different way. They run a little differently. And when God made us, the addicts on his assembly line, it's just like he created us in such a way that when we're plagued with self-pity and resentment, helping others makes us feel better. Bill says we feel amazingly lifted up and set on our feet. So he has a few final words. He says, the joy of living we really have, even under pressure and difficulty. So they're telling us we can be happy even when things are hard. Bad situations, situations do not have to define me and dictate my happiness. And he says there's scarcely any form of trouble or misery which has not been overcome among us. That's what's so beautiful about this fellowship. If we have a problem, there's probably somebody in this fellowship who's had that same problem and maybe mastered it, and we can help each other along. Page 16, last page of the chapter, he says, an alcoholic's in his cups, an alcoholic drinking, is an unlovely creature, but our job is to love them anyway. That's the measure of my spiritual experience. I can tell how badly I'm doing when I look at someone who's struggling and don't feel love for the person. That's when I realize I still have a long way to go in my own spiritual development. And they say recovery is fun. Yes, we're earnest, but it should be fun. Like we're not supposed to show up to meetings with a long face, or show up to work or family events a grump. it's fun, but they say underneath, faith has to work 24 hours a day, and that we don't have to look any further for utopia because we have it. Utopia is an ideal place. And Bill ends by saying, each day, my friend's simple talk in my kitchen when he was still drinking, but his friend intervened. He says, my friend's simple talk in our kitchen multiplies in a widening circle of peace on earth and goodwill to men. God sent a recovered friend to Bill, and Bill followed a set of simple but not always easy guidelines that allowed God to come in and do a miracle of healing. Because at the end of the day, what worked for Bill and what works for all of us helpless compulsive eaters is a miracle. God breaking into our hearts and minds in a way that is indeed miraculous. And with that, I will pass.